Welcome to Podsdale, where we explore the stories that make Scottsdale truly special. I'm your host, Holly Walter from the city's Office of Communication. Join me as we learn what makes Scottsdale tick. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. So excited to sit down with our guest today. It's someone I actually know very well through various activities and things happening all around the city, but we have Scottsdale historian Joan Fudala with us. Welcome, Joan, to the show.
Oh, it's so great to be here.
It's great to have you. Now, for those who may not know Joan personally, Joan was not too long ago named by our mayor as our community historian. Is that right?
That's right. In January of 2024.
Okay. So
it was quite an honor.
Absolutely. And, you know, there's good reason the mayor did that. You are probably one of the best people to reach out to if you're wanting to learn a little bit about Scottsdale or learn something about our past. So we'll get into that. But Joan, why don't we start by having you tell a little bit to the audience about yourself?
Well, I know a lot of people say, oh, you must have grown up here if you're doing Scottsdale history. I did not. I grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Again, a community that had great history, and I really started loving history from the earliest age. I went to the Ohio State University, where I majored in journalism and minored in history. And then my first career actually was as a public affairs officer on active duty in the U.S. Air Force. And my second assignment was here to Luke Air Force Base. And now I'm dating myself, but that was in the mid-'70s. Fell in love with the area. My first exposure to coming over to Scottsdale as frequently as the long drive from the West Valley was before freeways then. Right. And knew that also I met my husband, a pilot, at Luke, and we knew that once our Air Force careers and maybe civilian careers were over, we definitely wanted to come back here. So finished my active duty career after 9 years and transitioned into the Air Force Reserve, where I spent 12 years on the Air Force press desk at the Pentagon, and then had civilian full-time jobs during that time where I did PR for a chain of department stores based in the Midwest and also 2 regional airlines on the East Coast. But we finally decided in 1991 we really wanted to come back to this area. And I started here in 1991 as the communications director at the Chamber of Commerce and Convention and Visitors Bureau. And just in that job, I just saw what a rich history Scottsdale had, and how people were so interested, were visitors, new residents. They wanted to have that sense of belonging and know a lot more about history. So after 7 years of being the communications director, I decided I'd try to go out on my own. And as luck would have it, a publisher came to me the year that I left the chamber and asked me if I'd like to do a coffee table book about the history of Scottsdale that would be coming out in commemoration of Scottsdale's 50th anniversary of incorporation. And to be trite, as they say, the rest is history.
Right. Well, it sounds like that chamber position would be a great fit with your interest in history. And was that when you really began taking a deeper dive into the city's history and learning more about Scottsdale?
It was. At the time, the communications director for the city, Jer Indereden, and I, we were, and Jan Horn and several of the others that are in communications even still, we just had so many projects together that celebrated milestones in Scottsdale. And I just thought, you know, me as a relatively new resident then, and also seeing so many new people come here, I realized how important it was to give them a sense of belonging by knowing a little bit more about history. And also, because we were such an innovative city and had so many interesting ideas like the Indian Bend Wash and the beginnings of the McDowell-Sonoran Preserve, it was really important to make sure that people, whether they were residents or whether they were new in leadership positions, had a context of how those decisions were made. And even though maybe 20, 40 years after those decisions were made, it was time to tweak them, but in respect to the times and the people that made those early decisions, it was important to let people know about that, as well as kind of the fun aspects of Scottsdale history as well.
Well, I love that you bring that up because I think Scottsdale, we have some great stories to tell. And we've really, I think, set the tone for a lot of other communities across the United States.
That's right. And again, to me, I tell a lot of people when they say, gosh, is there enough to keep you busy? I said, Scottsdale provides a sumptuous banquet of themes and topics in Scottsdale in history. I mean, everything from sports and tourism to healthcare to citizen involvement to water history to Old West history to the diversity of culture history. It's just amazing. But again, it all kind of fits together to see how we've decided to make decisions that are the best for Scottsdale, and not just because another community does it. In fact, so many of our decisions, whether it was the sign ordinance banning billboards or whether it was not wanting the concrete channel to control the Indian Bend wash floods, that we always wanted to do what was best for Scottsdale and its citizens, just not just now, but for 3 or 4 generations and more into the future. And that's really kind of an exciting thing to watch how citizens have been involved over the years and things like that.
Right. And I'm glad that we acknowledge that piece. It's very important to talk about that citizen involvement that we have had because it is a huge piece of the city's history.
And I think, too, it's great because early on we were, whether it's volunteerism or partnerships with businesses, we've really looked for the best solution. One of the great stories was the partnership we had for years with Rural Metro to provide fire service, and that lasted 50 years as a public-private partnership. And we've had others, whether it's been in economic development or whether it's been support of the arts, where it's not just, let's just make the city government do it or whatever. It's just been such a great partnership to promote, and that really helps to promote citizen involvement by having all of those partnerships.
Right. And I know you mentioned your coffee table book, and I'd love to hear how long that project took, but I know you are a published author and you have some other books out there that talk about the city as well. Can you share more about that?
Well, again, I never really set out to do books. Call me silly, but I just loved Scottsdale history, and I didn't want anybody to just be sitting on history. We had a lot of great efforts way before me to collect history. I felt like there was a real need to do more sharing. So when that opportunity came to me in 2000 to do the coffee table book and just do not only synthesizing earlier research that had been done by other historians, but then collecting new history, particularly the 7th chapter, which was all about how we were in the preservation mode and how the McDowell-Sonoran Preserve effort came about. So it was an opportunity to share through getting new photos and getting new information. And also, because that was kind of the dawn of the digital age, that led to finally getting things on the internet. When I started researching Scottsdale history for that 2001 coffee table book, there was zero on the internet about Scottsdale history, not a photo, nothing. In fact, I tell a funny story on myself. I was Googling or whatever the search engine was back then, Scottsdale, and I found this little booklet that was on eBay. And it was only going to be $10 or something. And I said, finally, I found something that looks like it's an old book about Scottsdale history. And so I clicked on buying it, and a couple of weeks later it showed up. It came from New Zealand, and apparently there's a city in New Zealand that has a mountain range behind it that looks very much like the McDowells. It's called Scottsdale. And their founder looked very much like Winfield Scott, an old guy with a beard. And I thought, this is so funny that here I have just spent this money to get this book that I'm thinking is about our Scottsdale, and it's about Scottsdale on the other side of the world.
What are the chances of that? Well, I guess if you're ever in New Zealand, you're going to have to go and pay a visit to that mountain range.
But again, it was more than the coffee table book. It was really an opportunity, which again, there was a committee that we were meeting all the time to start planning for the 50th anniversary of Scottsdale's incorporation. And so not only me doing the book, but we were collecting a lot of history information and encouraging citizens to tell their stories, to bring in photos and documents, and really kind of add to our collective knowledge and to start digitizing that. And from that effort, a couple of years later, I did 2 of those Arcadia books that are all photos, one about Scottsdale in general, and then one about Scottsdale's 100 years at that time of golf history. And again, those books I've had such good feedback about because there's not a lot of text. It's all photos. And people who have said to me, and to me this is the ultimate compliment, gosh, I hated history in school, but I picked up one of your books and 3 hours later I'd finished the whole thing and I didn't even realize, that I was reading a history book because I was looking at a photo and say, oh, I've been in that building, but it's not that restaurant anymore. Or, oh, I know that neighborhood. That's where, friends of mine grew up or something. So that part was great. And then, gosh, a little over 10 years ago, the city asked me to do a book about how the McDowell-Sonoran Preserve was created.
Right.
And I've also done some privately published books. I did a book for the Charros about the 50-year history of not only the Charros, but spring training, which was really fun to do. I did a coffee table book for Desert Highlands and where the whole concept of desert golf started. And I also did a biography of the woman who championed a lot of the things at the railroad park, Zena Kuhn. She's the one that brought the Mercy train boxcar to Scottsdale to the railroad park. And she was also the one that started our Veterans Day ceremonies at the railroad park back in 1989. And she was quite the character with a very colorful history in World War II. So again, it's just been a great journey where I like I said, I never really set out to write the books, but the opportunities came, and that was just another way to not only share history, but a reason to collect more history, collect more photos that we can have now on the library's website through its partnership with the Historical Society. We can have as oral histories and whatnot, that it's just all out there for people to look at in the future, not the way I've presented in my book necessarily, but all the raw materials, the oral histories, the chronologies, the photos, that somebody else can put their own interpretation on as well.
Right. And thank goodness that has evolved over time, right? I think the library, it's a wonderful online resource, and it's amazing what you can find. You can end up really taking a deep dive and spending a lot of time when you don't even mean to, but it's fascinating. And speaking of your book, the Scottsdale History book, that, in fact, it's a great book, and it's one that we actually hand out to our employees when they've reached 10 years of service with the city, and Joan is actually kind enough to autograph those books. So we thank you for that. And again, in the Office of Communication, Joan's a great resource because she has that public affairs background and kind of thinks along the same lines we do. So we reach out to you quite a bit for all kinds of different projects. In fact, one Kelly Corsett just happened to mention as I talked to him this morning and told him that we'd be getting together for this chat, but you do a lot with our veterans and history of Scottsdale veterans in particular, and you're a speaker at our annual Veterans Day event.
Well, again, as I said, I spent 21 years of my life, 9 on active duty and 12 in the reserves in the Air Force. And so I have a special place in my heart. And as an historian, I'm supposed to be objective, but I have a couple of areas that I'm definitely interested in as far as focus on Scottsdale history. And Scottsdale has not only authentic military history, what's now the Scottsdale Airport and Air Park was a World War II pilot training base. And on the other end of Scottsdale, Papago Park had a German POW camp during World War II. And we've had so many of our citizens, those that we know and those that maybe their names have been lost to history, that have served in all of the armed forces, men and women. And then a year and a half ago, a 10-year effort led by another veteran, Jim Geyser, resulted in us dedicating the Memorial to the Fallen on the east side of City Hall that lists 66 names of the men, all men so far, and let's hope no more names ever have to get added to it. But the 66 names of people since World War I that have lost their lives in military service. And includes a lot of names from our neighbor, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. But we've had such a great veterans history, and just looking at many of the contributions that they may have hung up their uniform, but their lifelong commitment to service and serving the community has been incredible.
Right.
I'm so pleased that Scottsdale has found many ways to recognize veterans and their lifelong service.
It's a beautiful memorial. And in fact, right in front of the memorial is where we host our Veterans Day event. And we'll be out there again this year on the City Hall lawn. So we hope that as many listeners who can join us out there for that. And speaking of our veterans, not to put you on the spot, Joan, but Kelly and I were saying to each other, it would be great to actually have you on the show again, maybe in a couple of months, and we can talk a little more deeper about some of those veterans and share those stories.
Again, I've never stopped being a public affairs officer to brag about veterans. It's like sometime years ago when the kids or the students at Cave Creek High School started doing that Since You Ask series where they went out and interviewed veterans. They came to interview me, and I said, gosh, I feel so, sorry for you because, you interview all these combat veterans and heroes, and the only thing that I could show you are some paper cuts because I was manning a desk and whatever. But I said my fellow veterans were doing, really important and heroic things. It was my job to brag about them and let people know everything that they did. And I guess I've never stopped doing that. So I'm always so happy to be given an opportunity to talk about veterans, particularly those that have gravitated to Scottsdale.
Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic, because I'm sure you'll be hearing it to get a date on your calendar to be talking about that. How did it feel when you were approached? Because you've been doing this for quite a while, but when Mayor Ortega approached you and asked, we haven't had a community historian in the past. So how did that go about? And were you surprised?
I was.
Pleased? Okay.
I was. And again, I'm an independent historian, so this is an honorary title.
Okay.
But I've had over the years contracts to do things for the city, for the Chamber of Commerce, for resorts and other businesses. And I think there's an advantage to being independent because I can look at the entire city. And also, to me, it's an advantage maybe to not have grown up here because now I'm not just focused on the neighborhood I grew up in or the school that I attended. I can really kind of look at business history, arts history, veterans history, whatever. But I've always loved doing projects with the city. And so it was really a great honor when Mayor Ortega said that he wanted to name me as Scottsdale's official historian. And I'm always happy to do whatever I can to promote Scottsdale history. And we have some great opportunities coming up for that.
We do. In fact, I know you've mentioned the several projects you've worked on, and one that I worked on with you in the past was what we called Celebrate 68.
Until the great rains came.
Until the great rain came. But it was still a wonderful event. But it was really to promote the opening of Scottsdale City Hall and talk about the history surrounding the Civic Center area. And yes, so we had an outdoor event planned, and then we had crazy rain that entire weekend. But, we still had a wonderful turnout, and people were there to learn a lot about the history of our city. And I know now we're working on something else, right?
We are, but I will make another comment about 68. Although we had a little bit of a rain out on the culminating event, we had a number of events leading up to that where we named a short street after Benny Gonzalez, the architect of the Civic Center. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting, and we had a pretty good turnout for it, is we had a forum at the Scottsdale Civic Center Library taking a 50-year look back at the key issues that faced Scottsdale in 1968. And we had Paul Messenger, the historian emeritus of Scottsdale, as well as Jerry McAlfresh, who at the time had been the city editor of the Scottsdale Progress, and then a woman who had been a student at Coronado High School in 1968. And from each of their perspectives, they talked about the pop culture things in Scottsdale, but particularly from Paul and Jerry, we got things that were thorny issues, like what the heck are we going to do with the Indian Bend Wash, because we didn't even have funding to do that yet, or the impact of war protests and the draft in Scottsdale and how that was impacting students, to just the need for a lot more infrastructure in Scottsdale, and the whole dawning of the urban renewal, where we had to actually displace people out of their homes in order to create civic centers. So when we look back at history, it's important also to look at the things that may have been a little uncomfortable to look at.
Sure.
But how we got through it, and in hindsight, what was good, what was bad, what could we have done differently, or let's celebrate how great things turned out. But yes, so getting back to your question about what's coming up. In a little more than 2 years now, in 2026, we have a 10-day or so period where we're going to be celebrating the 75th anniversary of Scottsdale's incorporation, which would be June 25th, 2026.
Okay.
Because we were incorporated June 25th, 1951. And then just a few days later, it's America's semi-quincentennial, that's a big mouthful, nation's 250th birthday.
Okay.
And so we now have just recently started a small planning committee that we hope gets a lot more participation as time goes forward. And we're calling it Celebrate 2026, so that people and organizations around Scottsdale have time to make plans, budget, and really make some interesting ideas on how we can commemorate these two celebrations. Something permanent, like back in when we had the nation's bicentennial in 1976, Scottsdale decided to plant 200 trees in honor of the 200th birthday of the nation. And there were many other. We also decided that that was going to be our first big time to collect history. And so the city contracted with a local historian, and that's the result of which was the biography of Winfield Scott, which actually was published by the city of Scottsdale. And that's the Bible about not only Winfield Scott himself, but also the early days of Scottsdale, in the Scott era, which was from 1888 to 1910 when he passed away. So this is the time for people and organizations, everybody from nonprofit organizations to schools to museums to whatnot, to put their thinking caps on and to realize that this is an opportunity to celebrate the best and reflect on maybe the worst. But also, just to come together and find wonderful ways to celebrate how Scottsdale and the nation have evolved.
Right. Yeah, that'll be wonderful. And I think that'll, especially like you said, Joan, we have a planning committee that's doing some initial meeting and talking right now, but I think it's going to be a great celebration. So, of course, if you're one of those organizations or businesses that want to get involved, feel free to reach out to the city of Scottsdale. You can email communications@scottsdaleaz.gov, and we can get you connected with the right people to learn more about this. But it's going to be a lot of fun. Now, before we close things out, Joan, I'm wondering, and I know there's so many different topics that you cover when we talk about Scottsdale's history, but, what's your favorite tidbit about Scottsdale history, if you could possibly pick one?
I knew you were going to ask that, so I went back and looked at a magazine article I did a couple of years ago about things that didn't necessarily warrant a whole article, but there were little tidbits and factoids about Scottsdale. And I pulled that up, and there are a couple that I love. We all love Parada del Sol, but in the early days, in the 1950s through the early 60s, the JCs that were sponsoring Parada had an annual contest called the Whiskerino. And it was a beard-growing contest. And in November, the men of Scottsdale, particularly the JCs, and our beloved late mayor, Herb Drinkwater, was one of them, they would have to go to their barber and have a photo taken of themselves, and the barber had to attest that they were completely clean-shaven on that day in November. And then when Parada happened, the Remington Razor Company sponsored this. they had a shave off, but before they shaved off their beards, there was a judging of the ugliest, the scraggliest, the longest, the grayest, and whatever of the beards. And I just think, yeah, what kind of Americana is that?
Right.
Don't you just love that?
I do. I think we should bring it back.
I know, me too. In fact, I teased our former mayor, Jim Lane, when he started growing a beard kind of in his last term of office, that I wondered whether his wife would support that. The idea of having a beard shaving contest, but he continues to have a great-looking beard. So I guess the Whiskerino thing didn't take off.
Oh, well, that's a great story. That's pretty funny, and that's one I've never heard.
Oh, another one that I love is when we were doing Celebrate 68, and I was looking at all of the plans for what was going to go on the initial part of Civic Center in front of City Hall and the library. The city manager at the time, Bill Donaldson, floated the idea of having a monkey island with live spider monkeys on a little island in the middle of the pond in front of City Hall. That never went anywhere, and fortunately, they decided to have swans in the pond instead. And also, this old Scottsdale Progress always had something funny on the front page, like the Monkey Island thing. They also ran a contest the first couple of years that El Dorado Park was open and had the fishing lake, that apparently there was a sighting of a monster fish, almost like Scottsdale's version of the Loch Ness Monster. And they actually had a contest for kids to see who could catch the monster fish. And there was even an insurance agent at Scottsdale that contacted Lloyd's of London to indemnify the city in case the monster fish ate one of the children trying to catch it. So you never know. There are some really interesting stories that you find when you're researching Scottsdale history.
Right. I wonder if any parents back then used that as a, threat to go brush your teeth or finish your dinner.
Because there's that monster fish.
Yeah, you got to watch out for him. I can't imagine if we had a monkey island outside of City Hall these days. So it's probably good that didn't materialize.
All those things you could say about monkey business and
right,
whatever.
Yeah, I have heard about the swans. They were a fixture outside City Hall for a number of years.
Right. Christopher and Robin were their names. Winnie and Pooh were the first ones, and then they had children. And unfortunately, not a good story, but some vandals harmed them. And so they decided that it would be best, not to have the swans anymore because some people just aren't very nice. So
that's unfortunate.
They went away.
No,
but yeah, they were.
Too bad.
And our former assistant clerk, Thelma Holbeck, was particularly into the swans and I think took care of their care and feeding.
I heard the swans could be a little ornery too.
Yes.
The ducks out there these days are much calmer, I think you could say. Well, Joan, thank you so much for taking the time to pop into the studio and share some Scottsdale history and tell us a little more about yourself. We would love to have you back some other time, and maybe we can talk about some of those Scottsdale veterans, and we'll certainly share more to come about Celebrate 2026.
Great. And I always have to put in a pitch that particularly in this age when people don't have hard copies of photos or hard copies of documents, that we still need recent history or, history from the 80s, the 90s, and today, whether it's photos or whatever. And now that they're residing on people's computers rather than in shoeboxes or photo albums, the Scottsdale Public Library as well as the Historical Society are always hoping that people will donate photos of Scottsdale or programs or invitations, any type of memorabilia, because, again, particularly as things get more digital, it's going to be harder for us to collect those things. And we always want to have people keep in mind that we're always on the lookout to adding to our community scrapbooks, if you will, whether it's digital or hard copy, so that in the future residents and visitors can also learn a lot more about today in Scottsdale.
That's a great way to wrap up the episode. And if someone has those types of items they're willing to donate, where should they go to do that?
Either the Scottsdale Public Library Civic Center. For those that may not have physically been there, a couple of years ago, we dedicated a separate room that houses Scottsdale history called the Scottsdale Heritage Connection. And also there are a couple of library staff members that, again, it's not an official archive. They help digitize and preserve those in that particular room. And then the Scottsdale Historical Society, they're more into the artifacts. And, we have the Historical Museum that's on the west side of Scottsdale Civic Center, close to the intersection of Brown and Main. And that opens again in a couple of weeks at the beginning of September with a great cadre of volunteer docents. So people can stop by and offer their things there as well.
Wonderful. And if you don't have anything, it's still a great place to pop into and take a look.
Amen.
Joan, thank you so much again for being with us. And hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Great. Thanks, Holly.
That's all for this episode of Podsdale. If you enjoyed listening, be sure to subscribe. You can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences with us by emailing communications@scottsdaleaz.gov. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Holly Walter signing off and inviting you to be part of the Scottsdale story.